Speak. He is planning a statement on Syria. It was supposed to start about 40 minutes ago, but we're told that his arrival is imminent. In the meantime, our State Department reporter, Christina Ruffini, has been standing by for us and sort of fleshing out the situation in Syria. What we learned today is that Russia and Turkey have hammered out an agreement to maintain a ceasefire, a sort of buffer zone in that northern region of Syria, Christina, where U.S. troops were maintaining that buffer zone. There was a ceasefire that had been negotiated with Erdogan, a temporary ceasefire, a 5-day ceasefire that was to end yesterday to allow the Kurds to get out of the area. Do we know what is happening in this sort of strip of land in this northern area of Syria? Do you know what's happening now?
According to administration officials we spoke to yesterday, the YPG forces, General Mazloum, who runs the SDF, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces, one of the groups that comprises that.
Okay. So, Christina, I'm going to
Yep.
cut into you because it looks like the president is about to speak. He's approaching the podium.
Well, thank you very much. My fellow Americans, I greet you this morning from the White House to announce a major breakthrough toward achieving a better future for Syria and for the Middle East. It's been a long time. Over the last 5 days, you have seen that a ceasefire that we established along Syria's border has held, and it's held very well, beyond most expectations. Early this morning, the government of Turkey informed my administration that they would be stopping combat and their offensive in Syria and making the ceasefire permanent, and it will indeed be permanent. However, you would also define the word permanent in that part of the world as somewhat questionable. We all understand that, but I do believe it will be permanent. I've therefore instructed the Secretary of the Treasury to lift all sanctions imposed on October 14th in response to Turkey's original offensive moves against the Kurds in Syria's northeast border region. So the sanctions will be lifted unless something happens that we're not happy with. This was an outcome created by us, the United States, and nobody else, no other nation. Very simple. And we're willing to take blame, and we're also willing to take credit. This is something they've been trying to do for many, many decades. Since then, others have come out to help, and we welcome them to do so. Other countries have stepped forward. They want to help, and we think that's great. The nations in the region must ultimately take on the responsibility of helping Turkey and Syria police their border. We want other nations to get involved. We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future. In any event, by the moves that we've made, we're achieving a much more peaceful and stable area between Turkey and Syria, including a 20-mile wide safe zone. An interesting term, safe zone. That's the term we're using. Hopefully, that zone will become safe. Thousands and thousands of people have been killed in that zone over the years. But it's been sought for many, many decades, and I think we have something that's going to be strong and hold up. Turkey, Syria, and all forms of the Kurds have been fighting for centuries. We have done them a great service, and we've done a great job for all of them. And now we're getting out. A long time. We were supposed to be there for 30 days. That was almost 10 years ago. So we're there for 30 days, and now we're leaving. It was supposed to be a very quick hit, and let's get out. And it was a quick hit, except they stayed for almost 10 years. Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand. I want to thank Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo for leading the American delegation so successfully to Turkey several days ago, along with National Security Advisor O'Brien. I want to thank them very much. The American delegation negotiated the original 5-day ceasefire that ended Kurdish fighters to safely leave. It just got them to a point where, frankly, it enabled them to get out, to go, and move really just a few miles in a slightly different direction. So this enabled them to do so. Countless lives are now being saved as a result of our negotiation with Turkey, an outcome reached without spilling one drop of American blood. No injuries, nobody shot, nobody killed. I have just spoken to General Mazlum, a wonderful man, the commander-in-chief of the SDF Kurds, and he was extremely thankful for what the United States has done. Could not have been more thankful. General Mazlum has assured me that ISIS is under very, very strict lock and key, and the detention facilities are being strongly maintained. There were a few that got out, a small number, relatively speaking, and they've been largely recaptured. I'm also sure that he will be issuing his own statement very shortly. We had a great talk, but we've saved the lives of many, many Kurds. He understands that. The war was going to be vicious and probably not very long. And I'm very happy to have been involved in it, as are our Vice President, our Secretary of State, and all of the other people on our team. By getting that ceasefire to stick, we've done something that's very, very special. But by getting the ceasefire after a tremendous amount of really tough war for a very short period of days, that is something very special. Our troops are safe. And the pain and suffering of the 3-day fight that occurred was directly responsible for our ability to make an agreement with Turkey and the Kurds that could never have been made without this short-term outburst. Should Turkey fail to honor its obligations, including the protection of religious and ethnic minorities, which I truly believe they will do, we reserve the right to reimpose crippling sanctions, including substantially increased tariffs on steel and all other products coming out of Turkey. We are now an economic powerhouse like never before, and very importantly, like no other. Our economic might is stronger than it's ever been, and our competitors are not doing very well. We also expect Turkey to abide by its commitment regarding ISIS as a backup to the Kurds, watching over them. Should something happen, Turkey is there to grab them. Further, we implore European countries to come and take those fighters that the U.S. captured and bring them back to their countries for incarceration and for trial. Until just recently, Europe has been very unresponsive in doing what they should have been doing for a long time. Now is their chance to finally act. American forces defeated 100% of the ISIS caliphate during the last 2 years. We thank the Syrian Democratic Forces for their sacrifices in this effort. They've been terrific. Now Turkey, Syria, and others in the region must work to ensure that ISIS does not regain any territory. It's their neighborhood. They have to maintain it. They have to take care of it. There were some political pundits who responded to Turkey's offensive in Syria by calling for yet another American military intervention. I don't think so. But halting the incursion by military force would have required deploying tens of thousands of American troops against Turkey, a NATO ally, and a country the United States has developed a very good relationship with, including President Erdogan. The same people that I watched and read giving me and the United States advice were the people that I have been watching and reading for many years. They are the ones that got us into the Middle East mess, but never had the vision or the courage to get us out. They just talk. How many Americans must die in the Middle East in the midst of these ancient sectarian and tribal conflicts? After all of the precious blood and treasure America has poured into the deserts of the Middle East, I am committed to pursuing a different course, one that leads to victory for America. Through much work, we have done things that everybody said couldn't be done. Today's announcement validates our course of action with Turkey that only a couple of weeks ago was scorned. And now people are saying, wow, what a great outcome. Congratulations. It's too early to me to be congratulated, but we've done a good job. We've saved a lot of lives. Most importantly, we have avoided another costly military intervention that could have led to disastrous, far-reaching consequences. Many thousands of people could have been killed. The last administration said Assad must go. They could have easily produced that outcome, but they didn't. In fact, they drew a very powerful red line in the sand. You all remember the red line in the sand when children were gassed and killed, but then did not honor their commitment as other children died in the same horrible manner. But I did honor my commitments with 58 Tomahawks. 8 long years after President Obama's ill-fated push at regime change, U.S. troops are still on the ground in Syria. More than 500,000 people are dead. Hundreds of thousands are terribly injured, and millions more Syrians are displaced. It really is a nightmare of misery. Across the Middle East, we have seen anguish on a colossal scale. We have spent $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East, never really wanting to win those wars. But after all that money was spent and all those lives lost, the young men and women gravely wounded so many, the Middle East is less safe, less stable, and less secure than before these conflicts began. The same people pushing for these wars are often the ones demanding America open its doors to unlimited migration from war-torn regions, importing the terrorism and the threat of terrorism right to our own shores. But not anymore. My administration understands that immigration security is national security. As a candidate for president, I made clear that we needed a new approach to American foreign policy, one guided not by ideology, but by experience, history, and a realistic understanding of the world. We are building up America's military might like never before, investing $2.5 trillion since my election. But we will not be depleted. We will not happen again. It will not be allowed to happen again, where our military is depleted, fighting in areas of the world where we shouldn't be. When we commit American troops to battle, we must do so only when a vital national interest is at stake. And when we have a clear objective, a plan for victory, and a path out of conflict, that's what we have to have. We need a plan of victory. We will only win. Our whole basis has to be the right plan, and then we will only win. Nobody can beat us. Nobody can beat us. I want to again thank everyone on the American team who helped achieve the ceasefire in Syria. saved so many lives, along with President Erdogan of Turkey, a man I've gotten to know very well, and a man who loves his country. And in his mind, he's doing the right thing for his country. And we may be meeting in the very near future. I also want to thank General Mazloum for his understanding and for his great strength and for his incredible words today to me, but me just as a representative of the United States, because he knows that we saved tens of thousands of Kurds. And we're not talking in the long term, we're talking in the short term. We're talking something that was going on immediately and something, frankly, that was planned for a long time. The job of our military is not to police the world. Other nations must step up and do their fair share. That hasn't taken place. Today's breakthrough is a critical step in that direction. Thank you all very much, and God bless America. Thank you.
Mr. President, you said that the ISIS fighters who escaped have been recaptured, but today your top envoy said that's not true, that they don't know where they are. Do you have a comment?
So there you have the president with his statement on Syria, not taking any questions there. But essentially, he came out to announce that the temporary ceasefire that the U.S. negotiated with Turkey has now become a permanent ceasefire that essentially Russia has negotiated with Turkey, but somehow the president's sort of taking a little bit of credit for that. So I want to bring in Christina Ruffini. Saw you there for 2 seconds. Christina, the president said a lot. He warned Turkey that if they did not respect religious and ethnic minorities, that he would reimpose sanctions. I'm not sure if those sanctions were ever actually imposed. I know that it was certainly a threat, and that was one of the ways in which the president was criticized when it came to this ceasefire, is that essentially Turkey got everything it wanted. It wanted to be able to move into northern Syria and sort of take that land, and they were able to do that and, of course, avoid sanctions. And so that's happened as well, and Turkey has actually given up nothing in return for those things. And he also said that, you know, America is responsible for the 100% defeat of the caliphate, but we know that at least 10,000 Kurds lost their lives fighting ISIS.
So there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
First of all, there was that initial round of sanctions that did go into place. Part of this ceasefire agreement, or hold or pause, depending on which country you're in and how you want to talk about it, is an agreement that initial round of sanctions, if this 120 hours held, which it seems to have, with the president now declaring a permanent, or permanent as it can be in this region, he admitted, kind of ceasefire, the first round of sanctions will be lifted, and what was being held over Turkey's head was another round of more crushing sanctions. Those will now not be implemented, so long as Turkey agrees to, as the president said, respect human rights and doesn't get involved in any kind of ethnic cleansing or anything like that. Something else you mentioned is the president taking credit for a couple things, including this agreement, the ceasefire, saying this was only possible, you know, the U.S. did this, no other country did this. I think Turkey and Russia and possibly the Syrian government in Damascus might disagree with that. The other issue is he's saying, you know, the caliphate, the ISIS caliphate, is 100% defeated. And he thanked the Kurdish partners, but said, you know, the United States defeated the ISIS caliphate 100%. None of the State Department advisors, none of the military advisors would agree with that assessment. And one of the big fears, one of the reasons we were there in the first place, was to keep ISIS from coming back. The big overarching theme of this speech was, towards the end, he started saying, you know, we're not spending any more American blood or treasure in this region where you let someone else fight over this sand. We're not doing it. America is out. It's time for other countries, other people in the region to step up and take this fight. And we're not sending American troops to this area unless it directly affects American security or American interests. But, however, one would argue that ISIS and the resurgence of ISIS does directly impact American security and American interests, and that's why we were there in the first place. If you remember, President Obama tried this. He tried to pull troops out of Iraq, and that's how we ended up with ISIS. So it's a little bit of a circular argument to say we're here because we didn't do enough, and now we're getting out. And to think that ISIS isn't going to come back stronger than possibly ever is a bit naive.
Yeah, and you know, speaking of ISIS, the president talked about a Kurdish general that he said he just had a conversation with, and that Kurdish
General Mazloum, yep.
Right, there you go, was incredibly grateful for everything. And he suggested, it seemed to me, that the members of ISIS and their supporters who are already being detained now would continue to be detained with the help of the Kurds. The Kurds are now guarding these detention facilities. There was a concern that if Turkey attacked, that they would maybe abandon those posts and put their energy into sort of defending themselves against Turkey. I find that interesting that the Kurds would still continue to protect these detention camps. I'm not sure where they're located, if they're located in this safe zone, but what do you make of that?
So I believe most of the camps you're talking about are located south of this safe zone, and those are areas where the Kurds and the SDF, for now, are still able to hold on to some of this territory. They're also, for the moment, still in control of places like Kobani, which is one of the bigger cities that U.S. officials are really worried about. However, that seems temporary. It seems fraught. It's very unclear whether they will be able to maintain control of these areas long term, because the Syrian government doesn't want them there and the Turks don't want them there. So the enemy of my enemy is going to have a hard time maintaining the security of these prisons if they're fighting against two different fronts.
Yeah, exactly. So listen, Christina, I want you to hang on, because we're also going to bring in CBS News White House correspondent Paula Reed joining us from the White House. So, you know, when the president makes these statements, there are multiple audiences that he is considering, right? Obviously, there's domestic audience and the foreign audience. He really made it a point to talk about how, you know, this country is no longer responsible for policing these, what he sort of, you know, calls ethnic and tribal rivalries. What sort of messages do you think he was trying to get out there?
That's right. He used the phrase bloodstained sand. The message he's trying to get out is to his supporters ahead of 2020. And Maria, I was with the president at his rally last week in Dallas. The place was packed. And the biggest applause line of the night is when the president repeatedly suggested that he was bringing the troops home. The crowd went nuts. And Marie, they erupted into cheers of USA, USA. And that message got across to the president because he has referenced that subsequently. It's clear that this is on his mind. And even if those statements, bringing the troops home, don't necessarily reflect the reality of what's going on the ground, that is the message that he wants to push. We hear it repeatedly at his rallies. He's always talking about how he wasn't elected president of the world, just the U.S. That always draws a pretty good reception. But I'm telling you, in Dallas, to hear those cheers, he heard them too. And I could hear in his remarks today, that's exactly who he was talking to. But it remains to be seen if it's true that the U.S. troops are coming home. There is still this outstanding question of what happens to U.S. troops who were withdrawn from Syria and are now in Iraq. The U.S. has signaled that they will remain there to continue to battle against ISIS. But earlier today, Iraq's defense minister came out and said, in fact, they will be pulling out in the next 4 weeks. We didn't get any clarity on whether they're coming home. The president also signaled he will keep some troops there to continue to protect certain oil resources. So even though he's telling his supporters the troops are coming home, that's not true for all of them.
Right. And, you know, he sort of would talk in the statement, would talk about Syria, but then expand it to the Middle East sort of in a whole. And the other thing that obviously he's not going to bring up in the statement, but, you know, he's also sending troops to Saudi Arabia as well.
That's right. And one country that was conspicuously absent from this entire announcement was Russia. The fact that Turkey and Russia have negotiated a separate deal without the U.S. On how to control northeastern Syria. It involves a ceasefire. It also involves pushing out Kurdish fighters who until recently have been fighting alongside the U.S. in the battle against ISIS. It's a very powerful example of how this administration is willing to cede influence in the region to Russia.
And I know that the president, you know, he brought up the previous administration and that, you know, so-called that red line that you know, the Obama administration failed to sort of go after Assad for. There's been much talked about this policy of regime change, not regime change. Is this a good thing? It certainly seems like for the president, regime change or not, that's not an issue. The issue is get out. It's up to them to figure out who runs Syria.
That's right. He's not particularly interested in who controls northeastern Syria. He does not show a lot of empathy or compassion for our allies, the Kurdish fighters. He doesn't seem to care. But again, this is not necessarily in response to some sort of cohesive strategy on the part of this administration or Republicans. The president faced a wave of bipartisan criticism for this decision to abruptly withdraw from northeastern Syria. And really, only people he's appealing to here appears to be his supporters, his base. He is thinking about 2020. He is not thinking about Turkey. He does not appear to be thinking about the future of Syria, or even in some cases, those troops on the ground in Iraq.
And Christina, he said that that he has done America's done a great service to the Kurds, and he actually sort of said something along the lines of all forms. And I presume that he's alluding to the Kurdish people who are in Turkey and elsewhere, because the thing about the Kurds is that they sort of ended up in different countries after the Middle East was kind of sliced up. When he says a great service to the Kurds, he's sort of ignoring the fact that the Kurds were also performing a great service.
Right. And he's also I think he's taking at face value calls that he said he spoke to General Mazloum, who's the leader of the SDF, and he was incredibly grateful. The president tends to be hyperbolic. We'll have to take his word on whether that's what he actually said. But the Kurds, that same general, in a letter to the vice president yesterday, did say that he was grateful to the U.S. and that he wanted to continue to work with the U.S. on fighting ISIS and things like that. And according to our Holly Williams, who's in Turkey, that's because the Kurds are so afraid of their fate if it's left in the hands of the Syrian government, the Russians or the Turks, that they're willing to stick with the U.S. as allies, even though we have basically abandoned them, because it's really their only option at this point.
Yeah. And this is, I don't know if you can even answer this question. Sometimes the president, he slips sort of little lines in when he makes some of these announcements. And he talked about the oil fields that were going to be protected by U.S. troops. And he said, and perhaps later on, something to the effect of later on, we'll determine what's done with that. It's Syrian oil, right?
It is. It had been out of Syrian control, and the big fear is that ISIS could get control of that oil and sell it to start refunding its organization and rebuilding the caliphate. So it depends on whether or not, the U.S. wants to keep. The optics of the U.S. in the Middle East have always been that we're there for the oil. Now the U.S. is literally protecting oil and making no bones about that. So we'll have to see long term how long the U.S. is willing to leave American forces there to protect an oil field, even if it means giving it back over to the Syrian government, who is allegedly an enemy of the U.S.
Right. So, Paula, you mentioned that the president received bipartisan condemnation for pulling the troops out of Syria. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you expect the reception will be from his fellow Republicans hearing this news?
It remains to be seen. The president is battling even within his own party on so many different fronts. I just can't even predict how his party will respond to this today. We know they're also being called to come to his defense in his impeachment inquiry, and there are concerns that he is not getting enough support from his party on multiple fronts. Remains to be seen if they want to continue to come out and criticize the way he's handled this. I do expect that he will certainly face continued criticism from Democrats, likely some members of his own party, but especially with what's going on the Hill today, it remains to be seen if they want to continue to hammer him on this point. One of the other big questions is left open, Anne-Marie, is what happens to the 12,000 ISIS fighters who are currently in the custody of Kurdish forces. The president made little mention of them. 4,500 of those fighters are foreign fighters. The administration has been on a campaign to try to find countries to take them, to figure out what to do with them. There are concerns that with this ceasefire, that there may be a massive jailbreak, that many of these fighters could get out and once again reform an army of militants. The president did not address that concern at all today. That will certainly be a question that he's likely to get from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, in fact, Christina, when the president talks about reimposing sanctions if Turkey does not respect the ethnic and religious minorities in Syria, they don't exactly have like a track record of doing that, particularly the Kurds who live in Turkey. And that's part of the reason why Erdogan considers the Kurds a terrorist organization. It really goes back to the Kurds who have been living in Turkey, who found themselves really sort of stifled, almost an attempt to erase their culture by the Turkish government, and began to fight back. So it's not like Turkey has a reputation of sort of protecting ethnic and religious minorities.
Well, the argument, so I've met with Turkish officials several times in the last couple of weeks, and the argument from their side is, you can't just use the term Kurds, right? Because there are Kurds all over Turkey. They marry with other ethnic minorities inside Turkey. They are specifically saying that these groups, which are under the SDF umbrella, there's a group called the PKK, which has been conducting terrorist attacks in Turkey for a long time, to go back to what you were talking about with them feeling like the Turks tried to strip them of their identity. The Kurds are one of the largest global minority groups that don't have a state of their own, because when European powers came in and carved up the Middle East, they kind of just drew a line, but in the middle of these lines was this big pocket of people who all had the same ethnic identity. So they've kind of been scattered, and they're one of those stateless minorities that has gotten the raw end of the stick several times, including right now. The Turks view the SDF and the YPG as terrorist organizations. So they say, we don't have to respect the rights of these people. They're terrorists. And that's one of the reasons they've declined to call this agreement a ceasefire, because they said you can't have a ceasefire unless you're dealing with two people of equal weight. We refuse to have a ceasefire. We're a country. They're a terrorist organization. So we'll agree to a pause, and now they're agreeing to a more permanent halt, but they don't even see them worthy of calling this a ceasefire agreement. And to Paula's point, it's not only the ISIS fighters that are being held in areas still controlled for the moment by the SDF. You also have these thousands of refugees in camps like Al-Hol, which are wives of ISIS fighters and children as well, and no one knows where they're going to go either.
You know, the president, and you sort of pointed this out, Christina, the president made this announcement about this permanent ceasefire. He said something along the lines of, but that's questionable in this part of the world, what a permanent ceasefire means. And then sort of a little bit later on, he talked about the safe zone. And then he said, isn't that an interesting term for this area, a safe zone? Hopefully it'll be a safe zone. Why do you think he keeps couching his statement?
I think the odds that you're going to get a complete ceasefire with no casualties and no repercussions are really slim, and I think the president knows that, and I think he wants to give himself a little bit of breathing room. So if we see reports of some atrocities, especially by these groups that are not the Turkish army but groups that they're supporting, I think he wants to be able to say, oh, well, you know, it's mostly a ceasefire and it's mostly a safe zone and it's as stable as we can get it, so that he doesn't have to put himself in the position of reimposing sanctions and basically calling this thing which he just declared victory on a failure.
And he mentioned that this is something that people have worked on for decades and have been unable to fulfill. And in talking about this, when he was talking previously about the more temporary ceasefire, the timeline sort of shifted with him. It was sort of years, 5 years, couple of years, and then it became like decades. Do you know how accurate that is?
I mean, it depends on where you're talking about. The Syrian war has been going on since 2011, so that's not quite decades. I was actually at the Syrian border. I covered a story on refugees in Lebanon in 2012, and these are long, simmering ethnic conflicts. But the current situation has not been going on for decades and decades in Syria. Syria was one of the more stable places in the Middle East 10, 12, 15 years ago. So it's been, the Middle East has been fraught for decades. I think that's fair. But this particular conflict has not been going on in its current situation for more than 5, 6, 7 years.
So, Paula, we talked about how critical some fellow Democrats were of the president. And, he's sort of got a lot of different fronts that he's battling on. Of course, the impeachment inquiry is one of them. It occurred to me that this is an announcement that didn't actually have to be made by the president, because essentially it's a ceasefire that's hammered out by Turkey, the Russians, and perhaps Erdogan. Really, America didn't play a role in this, what he's describing as a permanent ceasefire, just perhaps the temporary one. He needs a win, though. Is this the win that he needs?
Well, win small W. I think what he wants to get across to his base is what I said earlier, which is he wants to tell them that he's bringing the troops home, that he will no longer entangle U.S. resources in foreign conflicts. So, yes, as you noted, while the ceasefire was negotiated between Turkey and Russia with no input or coordination from the U.S., that's actually just a sign that he is ceding influence in the Middle East to Russia, not necessarily that he won anything. But sure, he's trying to paint this as a win or something that he negotiated as a success, when in fact he faced, as I said, this wave of bipartisan criticism from his own party, some of his closest allies. Senator Lindsey Graham, for example, they all condemned his decision to abruptly withdraw U.S. forces from Syria. So it's really hard to see this as a win. What this seems more of is that it is political messaging to his base ahead of 2020, trying to show that, hey, he made a promise to pull us out of these foreign conflicts, and he's kept that promise. But we know, in fact, there will still be U.S. troops on the ground. There's outstanding questions about what they'll be doing and where they'll be doing it.
All right, Paula Reed, Christina Ruffini giving us some insight on this announcement. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marie.
So the impeachment inquiry continues to look into why the White House decided to withhold congressionally appropriated military aid to Ukraine. Well, today lawmakers are questioning a Pentagon official who oversees Ukraine policy. Nicole Killian has more details from Capitol Hill.
Laura Cooper arrived on Capitol Hill for her testimony before Congress. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense faces questions about why military aid was withheld from Ukraine.
Get some background information about that based on her knowledge and experience.
Tuesday, Bill Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, told lawmakers the money was held up for political reasons. In his prepared testimony, Taylor said by mid-July,